Thank you first very much, everyone, for being here today and for taking the time to talk to people that are just getting started in this with what we think are great ideas and so forth. Curious to what you think. You all mentioned setbacks, right? I'm sure throughout your time, especially early on, I'm sure as an entrepreneur, wondering how did you get through those early setbacks when you were at the high risk proof of concept stage?
So let me just say something that dovetails off your question that is something that we've kind of talked about. So when you launch when you have a physical embodiment of your product, and I don't mean a prototype, I mean sterile plastic that can be used, let's say, in a medical setting, and you watch people use your product, and then you figure out, gee, I need to fix some features with it, or change the human factor issues, or manufacture in a way that that piece doesn't break off when they use it with other products that are in the domain. That experience of watching people use your product, that's your most valuable IP. So the initial IP usually is based upon some common experience, and you've put some common experience in with the unmet need, like in my case, let's say some kind of windshield wiper or something. And so everyone's had the experience of a windshield wiper. And every surgeon or circulating nurse has seen people take out a scope over and over. So let's say you, in my case, construct some kind of windshield wiper for the scope, and then when you see what the problems are with that idea, now you've had an experience that no one else in the world has had. You've seen what's wrong with that idea. That's where real invention starts, making the product work, and the inventions that occur after the initial idea to make it work. Not just the concept of some way to clean glass or check vision or make sinus care more carefully prescribed, but frequently it's the IP that results from the development inventive process. That's the true blocking IP that differentiates what you have. So I'm not saying setbacks can be an advantage. You're better off without any setbacks at all, but they frequently can create the true blocking IP that stops other people from reproducing that product. So that doesn't exactly answer the psychological issues of how you deal with the setbacks, because setbacks are never good. They burn money, they don't feel good, you feel like an idiot, your board may fire you. Those are not good things. But I just think the idea that the solutions to the setbacks in a developmental project result in your best IP, like the way you inverted your contact lens design, that's clever. It's clever. It was the opposite of what was intuitive, right? Yes. But they were mentally and psychologically facile enough to say, maybe we had it wrong. We should do the opposite of my original instincts, and that's highly creative. Very few people do that. So that turned out to be your most valuable decision, and you could never have done that if you didn't go the wrong way first, at least a couple of feet, let alone in my case, a couple of miles.
I think you have to have fortitude. You have to just decide you're not going to quit. But that also being said, deciding to choose a different wall to beat your head against is not quitting, right? So I think you'll come across problems, and I think sometimes people and I've done this, you keep thinking, if I just make this slight change, then suddenly this is going to work. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's also not true. And you have to be willing to adapt your product and make slight changes or things that come up. So like with our eye alignment, our digital, I didn't talk about this before, but our digital cover test, I initially had a completely different way I was going to do it. And then we were going to use infrared light, actually, to watch the eye move. But because originally the Apple phones and tablets and that sort of thing, the cameras actually would see infrared and not just visible light, but that apparently made pictures purple. So Apple and other companies decided to put a filter on the cameras, like regular, really nice digital cameras had, in order to filter that out. So fortunately, we hadn't really gone very far. We hadn't written any software or anything. That was just the original kind of concept. And it was like, okay, well, that's not going to work. I can't do that anymore, so now I have to do something different. But in some ways, like he said, I think when you've tried something and it didn't work, it does make you think about it a little bit differently. So especially that's important in your patent coverage. You don't want to just have it covered by the one way it can be done. You want to have it be covered every way that it can be done. And so those failure experiences, even if it doesn't exactly work that way, you can think of another way it would work. And then you want to be always thinking, sometimes you just want to find, in regular research, you just want to find a solution that works. But one of the things that's really important in entrepreneurial work is that you cover all of the ways in which something could work, and to protect that for your company. And Shu mentioned some things along those lines of, of changing things up or doing things differently, things along those lines. And so I just think it's important to just continue thinking of new solutions and new creative ways of doing things, and also be willing to realize that sometimes the reason why that something like that has never been to market is because everybody else quit when they were really close and just didn't realize it. So there's a fine line of quitting and beating your head against a wall.
And I would add one thing about the emotional aspect of that. I saw a great curve for the entrepreneurial's life cycle where they come up with a new idea, they're really excited, they're high, the world is excited with them, it's a new idea, they're kind of really on cloud nine when it's fresh. Then they start working on the idea. Now the idea is getting a little stale, the next year's ideas are coming out, you're running into problems with the idea, everyone else abandons you really quickly. And then you kind of go through this area of despair where you feel like you're the only, Milton Hershey, for example, who started all our chocolate bars, failed 5 times, went into bankruptcy. But nobody else is with you when you're really, drudging through the mechanics of your idea or your career or whatever it is. And then the people who become successful almost did it because of their love for these solutions, not at all worried about what the rest of the world was thinking or how much money you would make or any of that. And then all of a sudden they look, and now when they're becoming successful and all these people are latching onto them again and being like, oh, remember me, I helped you when you were starting. It's kind of like surprising to them because they were never at all focused on that. So another important aspect for me is if you're doing something that you're passionate about, that you really has true impact in the world, that makes you realize that if I'm working on this and I fail, I still had a great, meaningful life because it was worth doing. That is really important. If you are just trying to make money, there are much safer, better ways of making money than entering the entrepreneurial world. And in the end, money and prestige are just tools. They are so inherently worthless, but they can be used, if deployed well, to do something well. But really, the impact is helping somebody in Africa be able to see that otherwise wouldn't be able to see, or whatever your research is. So I would also make sure before you engage in entrepreneurialism, you have ability to mitigate the risk of those bottoms that you're going to go through, and make sure you're doing something that you're passionate about and is worthwhile in life to do. And if you have that, that is what will be able to sustain you through the tough parts of your career.
The chemistry of the room is creating new products, and so it's hard to see if those products will be successful, but there are a lot of great ways to be an entrepreneur that don't require that. If somebody just likes the word or wants to be self-employed or wants to have a shot to make a lot of money. When medical students talk to me about what field to go into, I recommend HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Because right now, all their brethren are focusing on apps and silly things like that. And there are some great industries out there that if you learn the science, you learn the technical part, and you just give great service, and service is an instinct. We live with it every day. You're going to be successful. There was some other point I wanted to make about disappointment along the way, but anyway, I'll kind of leave it there. Thank you.
Next question. You're thinking you have a question? Yes. Oh. Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear what Chris and Cheryl have to say about the setback question. Like, I bet you deal with that a lot. And how do you address that from your point of view?
Yeah, good question.
I think Wayne's right. Cheryl's never had a setback. She's fantastic. No, I'm sure she's had some. So, by the way, Chris Paschall, I'm with the TCO on the licensing team. So that's my day job. But in a former life, as kind of a side job, I have started and run 2 companies, so I can speak to the setback thing pretty well. In academia, failure is a bad word. You know, if your experiment fails, whoops, can't publish it. Oh no, I'm never going to get my PhD. I'm not going to get published in Nature. And in the business world, in the entrepreneurial world, that's not the case. Failure is a good thing. Failure fast and cheap is even better. So if you can get there, do so until you get to a solution that works and benefits tons of people. So, you know, to kind of instill an entrepreneurial climate or culture within a university, we have to get away from this notion, and I'm speaking philosophically, and this is my opinion, we have to get away from this notion that failure is bad. It's not. It's okay. In fact, it's inevitable and to be expected. So that's one thing, and I think all of the technologies we've seen over the years, the first disclosure we get in is just the idea, and it's kind of the framework for the problem. And I'm sure I missed your talk, Melissa, but I'm sure, you know, First Solution was not the one that is going to market. Am I right? Okay. In fact, I don't know if I've ever seen that. There's inevitable tweaking. It's an iterative process. That's a word that's used in engineering, but it's not, oh, first idea is going to work. I don't think I've ever seen that happen. Cheryl, I don't know about you, but I've been doing this more than a decade, and I've never seen it. So really, you're starting on the journey. That's not the end of the journey. Once you come up with the idea, that's just, you're off to the races, and then you're building on that. So don't look at failure or setbacks as anything more than a data point. So I'm going to hit you on your kind of your heart of a scientist. It's a data point, and keep plugging away, and it'll pop out eventually.
The problem is it's hard to write a business plan that says, I'll first launch the wrong product and forgive me. So, I mean, that's certainly right. I agree with every particle of what you said, but you know, it's hard to go to your board and say, the last 8 months of burn rate just went for not much, you know, but I'm trying real hard, and we meant well the whole time. So it's a tough business. A lot of in medical product development and everything that we've talked about. It's a contact sport. So, but it is fun, as per the point you made. Being inventive, working with inventive people, trying things out. That's a lot of fun. That actually is. It's a lot of fun. Cheryl?
So we expect that all to happen. I mean, I agree completely with what the panel has said. We design our accelerator awards to recognize that process. So our accelerator awards are set up with milestones. And if we get to a failure point on the milestone, we stop. We say, okay, we're not going to proceed with this. We'll go back to the drawing board and start over again. And as Chris said, failing quickly and cheaply, that's a success point. So I think failure is really only failure if we don't ever learn anything by it.
Just want to add one point more. My favorite book is this book called Grit by Angela Duckworth, and she is a child psychologist who looks at how to raise your kids to do well. And the number one determinant of success she found was people who view failure as a endpoint and see that as, okay, what am I going to take for the next step? And, you know, how did I fail? You know, where did I fail? And the people who do really badly are people who see failure as pervasive, like, oh, I'm not meant to be a scientist, or I'm not meant to be an entrepreneur, or my whole life stinks. This is just reflective of me. And so the kind of thinking when you do fail to really see it on a time continuum and really drill down on why you failed and learn from that and move on is a really important skill set to have to be a inventor or an entrepreneur.
I've also found that if you hire an engineer who uses the word fail fast, you want to choose a different engineer. Because there's this mantra that failing fast is a good idea because you might as well waste less money. At least you got to a data point. But honestly, this is kind of a sarcastic comment, but it's the real world. I found when I deal with an engineer who says, our goal is to fail fast, that's actually his goal. That's actually his goal, not to come out with the right product. At least you try to come out with the right product.
I think the other thing is too is be expecting it, like everything everybody said, be expecting it to evolve. If you think that your initial idea is the one that's going to go to market, you probably will fail. But I think the two things I've seen when I've seen other people work in this area and get frustrated, or when I've talked with other people who, like Chris and Cheryl, is that you don't get too married to your first idea, and also be aware that in order for it to be a product that people will want to buy, it's going to probably have to look a little, you're a focus group of one. Your own idea and your own opinion, you're a focus group of one person. So you're going to need other people's inputs to make it something that's going to be attractive to a lot of people.
I was wondering if the peculiar economics of healthcare, what impact that has on commercialization here, where patients are experiencing the care, but it's paid for by the government or an insurance company, or doctors are using the equipment, but it's paid for by the hospital. So what is the challenge of all that?
That's a good point. So in the operating room, and I always look at my circulating nurse when I say this, the biggest change that's occurred in the last 5 years is it's all about cost. So it used to be 20 years ago, if a surgeon wanted a product that he or she heard about, liked, saw at a trade show, and it cost less than $200, it was kind of a trinket. Sure, you can have it. You're a surgeon. You're important. You bring patients. Now, adding $20 to the cost of a gallbladder is a big, big deal. So cost neutrality right now in hospitals, you have to be cost neutral to get in the door or change the standard of care in the therapy. You can't, like what you're working on, you can't just say this is a better product, people like it, it makes surgery simpler. Because most doctors now are employed by hospitals, so the doctors don't quite have the control over the patients, that they can't just take their patients and go to Mount Carmel anymore like they used to. So now it's all about cost rather than benefit, unless it's a complete change in treatment paradigm and a therapy with clinical data, like you identified. You got to have clinical data.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. That is, you cannot come up with an idea that is more expensive and marginally better anymore. That is a very dangerous idea to invest 20 years in. I mean, our country spends 18% of our GDP on healthcare. It's so unsustainable. I mean, I just every day hear about families who can't pay for their drugs or pay for the care of their surgeries anymore, which was relatively unheard of 10 years ago when I started. So we need ideas that disrupt healthcare and tremendously reduce costs, so you have to think of ideas. If you have several ideas you're working on, this is another talk that I give, but I would always recommend people to start working on their second best idea first as their starting point, and you learn the process of commercialization with that. You learn a lot of mistakes, and then have your first idea. You can iterate on that, and then learn from all your mistakes before that idea gets burned with all of your learning. But if you have a group of several ideas, think about the one that reduces the cost of care by either making it more accessible, like with an app, or something that costs $200, and we're, like my idea, not because I had any thought on this, but when the Canadian government heard that we might be able to reduce antibiotic prescription use by 4%, they are tremendously ecstatic about that. And so now the money spent on our diagnostic is taken out of that budget, as opposed to I want a new curved suction in my operating room to operate with, and that costs $100. They're like, shoo, you've never needed it before. Why am I going to give it to you now? And it pulls, go insane arguing with some stupid bureaucrat about what instruments I need to do my operation. But that is the reality of our operating rooms now is everyone's getting paid a fixed amount for something, and so anything we spend more on compresses your margin, and that really changes everything on the way people think about the value of innovation.
I was just going to say, as we look at business models, when we see an invention and we say, what's the business model? I was reflecting on something you had said previously, maybe in a slightly different context, in that it needs to be win-win-win. So the patient needs to win with better treatment. The doctor needs to win, and that there needs to be a CPT code, and the cost of the product needs to be such that the doctor can make money on it. And the insurance company needs to win because it has to lower the overall burden of care. So that's when we look at what is the most commercially viable invention, those are the sorts of things that we look at simply because of all the changes in the healthcare system.
The other thing that Subinoy has run into, I believe, is that how you say your name? Shu? Okay. The other thing that I think you've run into, we're on some of the panel, and we kind of looked at each other about this, is you're never a prophet in your own town. That's some kind of biblical expression, I guess. But, I mean, in fact, if you're working on some, Tim, you've appreciated this too. It's if you ask your own friends or colleagues in the same discipline, what do you think of this idea? They'll never validate it. They are so. Have you experienced this too, Melissa?
Oh yeah, they're the worst people to ask.
They're the worst people to ask.
It's like providing medical care for a family member. It's a really bad idea.
Yeah, that's so funny. It sounds like you can go on about this, but their first instinct is they don't want to see you make money off some idea that because maybe they have ideas. So it turns out that like for example, when we tried to do some deals with some companies and they were going through our customer list, they wanted to know how many of them were my friends. Like the list is contaminated. My friends were the least likely to buy my product. I couldn't sell to. We didn't even have a rep in Columbus. I mean, we had 10 reps. We didn't even have any in Columbus. So you have to. That's why you get, as you've spoken to, Melissa, you get a network of advisors who aren't contaminated by that kind of competitive human emotion. Sounds like you've been through that too.
Yeah, actually, the first patent that was issued for the first technology I disclosed, I think everybody in my college told me that it wasn't a patentable idea. So when the patent was issued, it was kind of nice to send around the email and say, "Look, I have my first patent." So, yeah, they're not good barometers, especially if they don't do commercialization. So, I along these lines of sort of failing quickly or whatever too. And when you interact with TCO, I think I've seen a lot of people get frustrated because if you take an idea over to TCO and they don't jump up and down and say, "This is the greatest thing we've ever heard, let's go," they say, maybe we're just not real enthusiastic about this. People get really disappointed. But I would say you're all brilliant people. If they're telling you there isn't a market for this idea or that there's something about it that just isn't commercializable, thank them for saving you a whole lot of time and effort, and then take that information and see if you can come up with a better idea. You can come up with ideas they're not a dime a dozen. That's what my dean says, and I actually don't think that that's true. But you can come up with other ideas or other things to think about, especially once you start thinking this way in your work. And then you can come up with something that is better in terms of commercialization, that will bring in revenue, that will make your life meaningful, all of those things that I think we all talk about. So don't get upset if you take your first idea over there and it's not quite right, or they want you to change it. And I heard Shu say something that happens sometimes and you have to be ready, that I forgot to mention happened to me too. The first time I went over there with my idea for the app that we're working on, it was like this big, and I spent an hour with a bunch of people over at the TCO, and they said, "Okay, well, what else can it do? What else can you do with this app? What else can you do? What else can?" And we spent an hour doing this and expanding the idea into something way, way bigger. And it sounds like that's exactly the same thing that happened with Shu with his, with doing, instead of just having a clinical test, having the tissues or the wipes or all these other things that he could work on. And so be prepared for that. Your first idea will probably be way too small. And they'll help you if you work with them to make it bigger.
Yeah, one of most successful people in Appalachia, I forget what university this was, maybe Ohio University, I'm not sure, but they started with an idea. I frankly don't even remember what that idea was, but got the whole town, Ohio University, like a startup community behind them. They worked at, the inventor came and talked at a OSU panel several years ago. They worked for about 10 years making no revenues on this idea, but had the whole town behind them. Out of their R&D outfit, they developed some lab test, that was a needed component of what their main idea was. That eventually got licensed to some company and made $150 million. And that was the, key revenue producer from their startup. Like for me, for example, by me going out into private practice and starting my own practice, I then started working on a stem cell therapy to regenerate sinus disease. By far, that has been the most financially beneficial part of my life. Like, people pay thousands of dollars in cash. I don't have to deal with an insurance company. I get paid the second I do it. Completely an offshoot of all this endeavor to go private to start, a sinus swab. And if you are of the entrepreneurial mindset and you're looking for things to do better and you're trying to do everything that you do in your life better, out of that, good things will happen. You just don't know where they're going to be, but you can never be discouraged because your idea number one doesn't pan out. Also, don't ever be wedded to an idea and be, afraid to improve that idea. And, just the culture that comes, a lot of other good things will happen. And kind of the final point on that is, it is risky to be an entrepreneur. For me, what was really helpful was to not be in any debt in my career, to be able to take a year or two off to start a practice where I wasn't dependent on, the same salary that I was making while I was at OSU. That helped me kind of make the jump, and frankly, at least from a financial standpoint, has been a net positive. Also from a career standpoint, I would say for me. But it's hard to be an entrepreneur if you have a lot of debt and you have a lot of other responsibilities and a lot of risk you're taking in other aspects of your life, because there could be months or years, maybe not where you're financially hurting, but you could be emotionally hurting, where you're not happy because your idea is not working, and it can affect all the other aspects of your relationships. And so you need to have a lot of reserve and kind of internal confidence, I would say, to be able to weather kind of the dips of your careers if you engage in a higher risk activity.
One of the things I'll just add to that really briefly was I know I've seen Shu at basketball games too. So I think for me personally too, going through this experience and talking about it when I'm at home, my family, of course, knows I'm doing all this sort of thing. If you have children who think everything should happen instantly, this is a really great lesson. My son used to ask me on a regular basis, "Aren't you done with your app yet?" And so having in some ways, I think entrepreneurial activities are going to be a great way to educate the next generation about things don't happen quickly. So not everything happens instantaneously. And so for me personally, that's been a great lesson for my son to see me struggling, working hard on something, and having it take a longer time than expected. And I think that has a lot of benefits in terms of teaching your graduate students, anybody else around you, that, what things look like when they're worth doing and they take a long time.
So I have a two-part question for Shu. First, can you talk about the differences of what it's looked like for you licensing the technology from the organization which you work with to other organizations, and then being on the other side of that fence of licensing someone else's technology, and then dive into the technology a little bit and talk about why that pivot was made, and how you can identify opportunities like that to maybe take something that's geared for the human market and take it into veterinary med or other platforms.
Yeah, that's a great question. I could talk a lot about that. Number one, and I'll use that to bring up another point, is I think a very important part where academic entrepreneurs fail is they have a license, they have a great idea. They've spent many years doing research, they're the expert in that field, they are convinced that this idea is going to be outstanding. Then they take it to the licensing office at OSU. They get frustrated that OSU doesn't think that their idea is the number one most important idea, and they're taking some time to digest it. And then they often get irritated when they start learning about the sharing rights with a university, that the university has the right to own your patents and that they will give you a percentage, which differs at a variety of universities. And then that academic inventor is like, I did 100% of this work. I deserve 100% of everything, and I get very irritated. And so I'm going to quit, and I'm going to do this all on my own and do it. The part that people don't realize is the value of a company is generated by the licensing terms, like how well the university licenses your idea to the right venture capitalist and CEO, and how good that CEO is in commercializing your idea. I think Wayne is unique in that he went full tilt, trained as a urologist and then became a CEO. Most academic inventions are not done that way, especially drug inventions. It's very hard to start a pharmaceutical company. But what your value is going to be is how well, Cheryl and everyone else in the organization finds a good CEO for you, gets good terms, like are you going to get a 3% royalty from that, a 5% royalty? Because that is way different and much more valuable than am I going to get a third of what the university gets? Am I going to get 40%? Because 40% of zero is not, is nothing compared to 10% of 100 million. And so, that's what we lose sight of, is that our percentage of what OSU gets is not nearly as important as, is my idea going to become commercialized? So that's a huge important aspect. So for most inventors, the university will start to work with that, and we'll try like a marriage, finding you with a good VC, a good CEO, a good startup firm. Maybe it's a student at OSU's business school who is also really, their mom has the same problem that you're working on. They try to find a good marriage for you guys. That's really important, finding a good team to work with. And finding a team is critically important. In terms of the licensing components, like learning, gross versus net royalty, or the engagement of your patents, how your patent can get diluted, all those kinds of things. I had to learn because our initial startup fell through, and I kind of was working on my own. But I would say our licensing office now is excellent at that. Has really gotten a lot better over the years. You can trust them, but you should be involved in the process and want to educate yourself and know all those terms. But the university is going to be on your same team. Their royalties are a percentage of your royalties, so they're both now excited to see that you succeed. So that is a great advocate to have, because if you had to prosecute a patent, or a company ended up doing something mischievous, you were dead. And that happens, frankly, a lot to solo inventors. Companies know you're absolutely no threat at all. If a company wants to go against Ohio State, that is that's not something that they're interested in fighting. On the other hand, maybe it was Wayne or Melissa's point, companies don't like working with universities because of the legal process. It takes forever for OSU's legal office to work at the speed of business. So a much better route to go through is to form a startup, work with a smaller company, get your IP licensed to the startup, get all that legal done. And so then the big company, if they like your idea, can buy the small company, and they just do that quickly. That's what they're used to. They've done that all along. They don't like working with universities at all. So, and to Wayne's point, for everything, you are not going to create an invention that because you wrote a patent or an IP disclosure, some company's like, oh my God, that's the best idea we've ever heard of. Here's $10 million for your brilliant idea. That is not how entrepreneurialism works, or commercialization works. And to an even bigger point, it could be the greatest idea. If it doesn't make money with a CPT code, I was really disillusioned. I worked with Medtronic to create this hydrodebrider that washed out biofilms out of your sinuses, and it had really good data behind it. But we didn't have a CPT code, so it was coming out of the margins of our surgery center if somebody wanted to use it. It had, after several years, despite amazing data that washing your sinuses is good for you, like washing your hands is good for you, maybe a 3% adoption rate across the country. Like no money. Medtronic could care less about this product. So if a product doesn't make money for a company, it has no chance of being successful. And so how a product makes money, I would say most of the people in here don't know what a COGS is, don't know what an average wholesale price is, don't know what an average retail price is, don't know what an average margin on a product should be, at least 70 to 80%. All of this business knowledge, most people don't know in this room, because you guys are brilliant in your fields, and so you need a good team. And now, on the other side, I was a finance major in college, so I have a little bit of this background. Why, I learned how to start a company. I spent a couple years working closely with our CEO, and so I don't know. My career is relatively unusual, but we founded a company. I could capitalize it. I'm a surgeon. I'm lucky in that sense that I have money to risk to start an angel round, and then we and then in the world of trying to pitch my sinus product, we met a lot of VCs and we met a lot of private equity people that we could do a Series A round for. So my our nasal gel, we relatively, commercialized it. Packaged it, manufactured it. We started a manufacturing plant in Florida, and we got to first revenues on that very quickly, within a year, because the vet world has a low barrier to entry. And so now we're trying, just like Wayne said, we're trying to expand our sales force. We need to get, ideally our revenues up to hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars to potentially get an exit. That is a different world that I learned purely from the experience of marketing the sinus swab, and it took me several years of me being very interested and passionate about trying to start a company. And so I kind of skipped the CEO role, and I went straight to a founder role, and I hired a CEO. And so that is not typical, I would say, of many investors. But it is typical of the life cycle of a successful entrepreneur. Like after entrepreneurs do well in their company, then often they join boards or they become private equity on their own, and they like that challenge of creating a new product, so they like investing in people in this room and starting up again. So you will see, successful entrepreneurs come back and want to engage again. They don't have the energy to spend 80 hours a week on a new idea again, but they would love to finance it because they had a huge exit and did really well. So, but I would say initially, for quickly answer your question, Tim, is to work with the licensing office, and they'll educate you on these terms, but do not be worried about the terms that, or be worried that you're going to be exploited by the university somehow, because that's typically not true.
Do you have something to add, Melissa?
Oh, actually, I'll add something really quickly, and then we have a grant interview in the morning, and I have 3:00 meeting I have to go with them to prepare for. But if some of this sounds intimidating to you, again, just to go back, I didn't leave the university. I'm not a CEO of a company, but I will say that one of the complaints I've heard from a CEO who's worked with several different inventors, even from multiple institutions, is they do like an engaged inventor. If you can't, I don't think it works well personally to work something up, hand it off to TCO, and then just say thank you, goodbye, and never talk to the company again, they will need your help in some way, shape, or form. So, none of us have done that for sure, and I actually think that is, I've heard of inventors at Ohio State where once it's licensed, they say, okay, thanks a lot, and then they never talk to the company again. And you can do that. You're not obligated to ever talk to the company again, but I personally wouldn't recommend it. I would recommend that you will have a more successful product longer term if you're willing to just do a couple of hours a week of meetings on the phone with venture capitalists and things along those lines and talk about the technology. And I think that will keep everybody motivated longer. So just one of those things to kind of keep in mind. You do have a huge range of how you can be involved in as an inventor. From everything from handing it to TCO and walking away to starting, being the CEO yourself. But I would definitely not recommend the handing it off to TCO and never talking about it or looking again. So. Yeah, sometimes it depends on. There's some circumstances that I'm sure it would work. But if the company needs you, try to be available for them. So. Yeah.
I want to thank our panel and thank you all for attending, and I hope this has been a very helpful session. And there will be an evaluation coming to you by email, so keep a lookout for that, and hope you'll give us good feedback about this program. So thanks again to everyone.